And then on the other end, there can be these extreme levels of depression and withdrawn. And there's people who actually, this makes them feel like they're going crazy from swinging from pure ecstasy to depression and back and forth. It often can make people feel like they're losing themselves or losing their mind. There's an anxiety about being rejected. And so there's always this feeling. On a biological neurochemical level, and I think this is something that's important, is that when we're going through the limerence phase, there's a neurochemical that is flooding our brain called phenylethylamine, okay? And it is actually amphetamine. And if you want to think of amphetamine, methamphetamine, stimulant drugs, those things that people take to get feelings of euphoria. During the limerence phase, we see high levels of this amphetamine being shot into the brain in a sense, which accounts for the exhilaration feelings. And sometimes, like with methamphetamine, it can bring up feelings of paranoia that can and this paranoia can drive us to think, crazy, not crazy thoughts, but suspicious thoughts about what we're getting ourselves into. And because of this amphetamine, we do know that there are people who get addicted to the limerence phase. Okay, meaning what happens is they get into this, they get that exhilaration of that chemical rush in their brain. But once it starts to wane down, they get out of the relationship and into another one. This is if you've ever been with someone who has real commitment issues, but doesn't necessarily have a history of heartbreak. Just they just don't want to be committed in a relationship. Oftentimes we find that these individuals are addicted to that amphetamine that is being shot into the brain from that new relationships that continue to develop. And then when the amphetamine levels go down is when we see individuals cut off or say, I don't want to be committed. I don't want to do this, that, and the other. This period lasts from about 18 months to 3 years, which according to FIS, withdrawals often lead to the 4th year heighten in divorce rates. Okay, and I mentioned this before on the previous slide, that we do see spikes between the 4th and 6th year of relationship. And there's some evidence, there's some biological evidence, because we stop producing this amphetamine and we start producing things like serotonin, which calm us down and make us feel committed and intent, but it doesn't give us that high that this natural amphetamine provides. The next phase of love that starts between 3rd to 6th year is what's called companion stage. In the companion stage, it's characterized by, instead of sexual and physical intimacy, it's characterized by more emotional intimacy, attachment, and deep affection for that person. We see that the sexual interest and the obsession over the individual start to wane. And we see, instead of dependency on each other, we start to see an increase of interdependency. What I mean by that is, instead of seeking out emotional fulfillment in that relationship during the companion phase, we start to rely on each other and go to each other to provide for advice and whatnot. Instead of the physical part and the sexual part, we start to relish things such as shared food, joint slumbers and naps, and develop an easygoing acceptance for each other. And during this phase, we go from amphetamine to producing a natural opioid, which produces feeling of contentment, and the anxiety in the relationship is reduced. So if you think about this, in the first phase of relationships, we're releasing amphetamine, which is an excitatory chemical. And then when we get into the companion phase, we start to develop opioid type chemicals that give us this feeling of contentment within our relationships. Now, one of the mistakes that are often made, or we see within the research literature often made, is mistakes that can be made is mistaking that contentment and anxiety reduction is a sense of stability. And this is one thing we'll learn as we go through this about what is it about people who are 20, 30, 40, 50 years into their relationship and they still are in love and they still really care for each other. What we find is they have a different mindset than a lot of people, that they don't see most people when they get into a relationship feel that the relationship is a rock. It's not movable. It's their base of being. But people who continually stay in love realize that their relationships change with them, that their partner changes, that they change. And so the relationship itself has to go through constant change. And we'll see when it comes to how to maintain a long, happy relationship, a lot of these individuals renew their relationship over and over and over, okay? I always scare students with this idea about, if you have grandparents who have been married for a long period of time, according to research that has been done, it's because they've been very, in the area of sexuality, they continually change and try new things. And so in a sense, if you have grandparents who have been together for a long time, likely they've been pretty kinky in the bedroom. And that's something that we found. So in that arena, they change. In the other arenas, they change according to who they are and the individuals they become. And they continually fall back in love with each other, with the person that they're becoming, not the person that they were. And we see in a lot of relationships that fell, there's the complaint about he or she is not the same person they were 10, 15 years ago when we met. And that's the mistake in thinking, is that we have to understand that we have to continually fall in love with the same person. Okay. We do need to recognize that that there's roles of emotions that play into this, such as anger, hate, romantic jealousy. The most common is sexual jealousy, has been found across cultures to be the main motive when men murder women. So if we look at crimes of passion, if we want to put it that way, if we look at when a man kills their spouse or their girlfriend or their intimate partner, the majority of time and cross-culturally, it comes down to sexual jealousy, that the person feels like their partner has access to multiple people, and just that pure thought of that can lead to commitments of violence, and in the extreme cases, cases of murder. And we'll get into this a little bit later. I think I'm going to invite someone to come talk about this specifically based on her life experience with this happening to a close friend of hers. I think it would be important to hear the story if she's comfortable in doing that, and I'll invite her and see and talk with her about that specific experience she had with a good friend of hers. But we can see romantic jealousy can drive a lot of issues. For women, we see, while it's more rare women murdering men, it less has to do with sexual jealousy and just has to do with either violence in the home or just the female partner feeling trapped and feeling that the person doesn't it doesn't care for them anymore. So doing research on comparing people who stay together for a long, long time, and comparing those to people who get out of relationships very quickly. And so we've interviewed people who were in relationships for up to 10 years. And then we interviewed people who have been in relationships for 20 plus years. Now, there's a wider range of things that come up, but there tends to be three key aspects of individuals who remain in a relationship, in a healthy relationship, okay? And so we took this data. I should clarify. So we compared people who ended relationships in 10 years, and then people who stayed in relationships well beyond that. And then we compared people, one who after 10, 20 years are still strongly and intimately in love. And then we compared them with people who just tolerate each other. They stay in the relationship because it makes economic sense, but there's no emotional connection there. They're basically roommates. That's phase 2 of the research. Phase 3 of the research compared people again who have been in long-lasting relationships where they profess that they're still completely and totally in love. And we compare it to people who are in toxic relationships that got out of the relationships for things like domestic violence or constant arguing or the like. And we find in comparing all three of these different types of groups that there tends to be three main things that come out, three main key trends that we see. And so we label this as what is a healthy relationship. And these are the three things that are consistently found comparing those three groups. The first one is emotional security. Now, emotional security plays out like this. It is the ability to go to your partner and tell them anything you want without them giving negative consequences back, like saying, oh, you're being ridiculous, or they're getting angry, or they get upset that you're bringing that topic up. People who are in long-term healthy relationships tend to have this emotional security that they don't feel like they could hide anything from their partner. This is the person in the work office or in the school when they hear people say, oh, I couldn't tell my husband that, or I couldn't tell my girlfriend that, I couldn't tell my wife that. If my wife knew that, oh my gosh, the world would end. These are the individuals who don't understand that. They don't get it, okay? The second thing we find is that they tend to be best friends, okay? And I always use this kind of, I've seen these memes around on Facebook and TikTok and all those different social media sites about the difference between a friend and a best friend, okay? A friend is someone who will bail you out of jail, where a best friend is the person that will be in the jail cell with you, okay? And if you understand that analogy, you get the idea that this is something that is important to them, that these individuals they belong with. Now, this is not to say that they don't have their individual lives or their individual hobbies or their individual friends, okay? This is not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is there's something unique about these relationships that don't often happen in other relationships. So I'll take an example. Let's go with a married couple, husband and wife. The husband goes out to his let's say plays baseball with his friends, and his wife goes and spends time with her friends at a friend's house, okay? What we find very unique about this is they have their own separate experiences. But within 24 hours to 48 hours of getting back together, they relive their individual experiences together. So the man comes home and says, yeah, it was a fun game. What's his name got hurt. Stay away from Joe. He's being kind of weird. And she'll say, yeah, there was a lot of things said. We had a lot of fun. They relive their individual experiences together within about 24 to 48 hours of each other. And that is something, and this is where this notion of best friends comes from, okay? The other thing that we find is what's called role formation, okay? Now, role formation in healthy relationships is when one individual understands the qualities they bring to a relationship, the other person realizes the qualities they bring to a relationship, and the qualities they don't have, they do together. Okay, so a typical example, if we go with a stereotypical male female, the female is good at taking care of the home, and this is just an example. The man is good at taking care of the yard, but maybe they both hate dishes, doing the dishes. Okay, so they do the dishes together. Okay, that's role formation, is understanding the qualities that each bring to the relationship, and the qualities that neither one of them have, they work on together. Okay, now a lot of times I get in classes, well, what about grandma and grandpa who have been in a relationship for 40, 50 years, and they're still madly in love, but they have that traditional relationship where the man is the dominant figure, quote unquote, king of the house, and the female is the homemaker and is submissive to the father. I mean, not the father, the husband. And we looked at this relationship, and this is the thing we have to understand, is the research on this came out from people who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s that live those traditional roles. But what we found out, and this is the main difference between the individuals who stayed together and tolerated each other, or the people who separated, and those who after 30, 40, 50 years say they're still madly in love, but still have that traditional role that they grew up with, is that there's a different type of language they use. Instead of saying, yes, I must do everything Joe says, they say, I wanted to be the homemaker. I wanted to be submissive. I wanted to be taken care of. And the man will say, I wanted to be, the ruler of the house. I wanted those things. And so if you see this, that even in that role type of formation, that's an equal relationship because it's something that they both wanted. And so even in traditional relationships where from the outside in, it looks like there's a disequilibrium in power within that relationship, but those two, for some reason, are still madly in love, and that might not make sense to younger generations of why they would put up with that, quote unquote. If we really talk to them, they say, that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted in a relationship. And I found that. They found each other. Okay. So these tend to be the three key things that we find consistently when we compare people in a long-term relationship who are madly in love compared to either individuals who are just roommates now, or people who have quit their relationship or have separated. Okay. Is there any questions on these three factors that we've talked about? You know what? I just realized something. Okay. All right. So no questions. go ahead. Okay, all right, there we go. Okay. I do want to talk a little bit about what is a toxic relationship. And we have to talk about this from different range. Later in the semester, we'll talk about intimate partner violence, also known as domestic violence, dating violence, and those types of things. And yes, when we get to that section, we will see that they have a very toxic relationship. But toxicity of the relationship doesn't necessarily always involve physical and emotional violence towards the partner. Toxic relationships are ones that could just be degradative to the individuals who are involved in the relationship. And so, you know, some examples of the toxic relationships we can talk about here is when they don't have role formation. Okay, if we go back to here, where one person is dictating all of the power, and this was not an agreed upon thing, that creates toxicity in the relationship. When there's no emotional security or very little emotional security, or one or both partners is always getting torn down for bringing up their feelings and their experiences. And we see in a lot of toxic relationships that there's the lack of friendship between the two. Yes, they might be in the limerence phase where they're getting that amphetamine thing, so they might be wild about each other, but they really don't have even that close friendship with each other. And the reason why we call this toxic is if you look at the word toxic, usually when toxins are put in slowly, it corrodes the relationship over in time. So if we put some acid on metal, it usually doesn't burn a hole right away. It takes sometimes weeks, months, or years for the acid to actually eat through the metal. And I always like using the analogy of the Milgram studies. If no one knows about the Milgram studies, this is just the short version of it. Okay, Agatha, thank you for letting us know. I hope everything is okay. So with the toxic relationship, what we see, and I'll bring up the Milgram study as an example because it's a good analogy. In the Milgram study, what they had is they brought participants in. One is going to be the student, the other one is going to be the teacher. Okay. They make it look like you had a 50-50 chance of being either one, but in reality, the participant was always going to be the teacher. And then the student is going to be a confederate of the experimenter or part of the experiment. And the idea is that every time they have a shot box that starts with 15 volts, and then it increases in increments on switches by 15 volts. So 15, 30, 45, and so on, clear up to 450 volts. Okay, 450 volts is dangerous, the potential of death. Okay. And in this experiment, what they wanted to know, so each wrong answer, you flip a switch on the box. And what Milgram wanted to know is how many people would go up to 450 volts, okay? Now, we won't get into the specifics, but basically about 2/3 of people will go all the way up to 450 volts and be willing to shock someone to the potential detriment of that person's life. But the key thing that Milgram found is that to get 2/3 of people to do that, you had to do it incrementally. You had to start with 15 volts. If they started with 450 volts, almost no one would do it, okay? This is likened to a toxic relationship and how toxic relationships can evolve into things like domestic violence and relationship violence and those types of things. So it always might start with 15 volts, like things like, oh, why are you wearing those clothes? Oh, you look gross, to the next level, you're such a idiot, to the next level, you're such a bitch, to the next level. And what we found, unfortunately, is when someone gets to 150 volts, almost all of them, greater than 90%, will go to 450. And that's what we see in toxic relationships, is the person gets to that 150 volts and they feel stuck. And the toxicity continues to get worse and worse and worse. And the person will stay in that relationship because they don't know any other route. And then sadly, a lot of toxic relationships end up in 450 volts, where we get to spousal murder, where we get to domestic violence, where we get to relationship violence, where we can see couples getting in the dwells of addiction and decompensation in their social world, okay? We'll have more to say about this later when we get into the end of a relationship that ends for example, violence and those types of things. What I want to put in our minds right now is toxic relationships don't always start at 450 volts. If you think about it this way, if you're dating, let's say a male or a female, and on the first to second date, they were to say, you know what, I got to tell you something. One, I'm going to think that you're worthless. Two, expect me to not care what you think. Three, I'll probably start beating you eventually. That's because you just bug the hell out of me. I would be willing to guess 9 times out of 10, you would walk out. Probably 10 times out of 10 if that happened on the first or second date. Toxic relationships don't start right away. They evolve over time, and they steadily get worse and worse and the person often doesn't recognize it's getting that direction. Okay. And this will lead us to a conversation about divorce and separation. I'm not sure if I mentioned it in this class, but our divorce rates are steadily increasing, but so are our marriage rates are steadily decreasing. And so what we will need to talk about when we get to end of the relationship issues is things that affect divorce, such as the effect on children. Very greatly depends on the sources. And this is just a preview of the things that we will talk about in the coming weeks to come. All right. So I got through this lecture a lot quicker than I thought I would, and I'm not prepared to get into the in-depth conversation about attraction more than what we've already talked about. So I am going to ask, does anybody have any questions about the content we went over today?
I don't, but I just thought it was very interesting.
Oh, thank you, Rose.
Yeah, I agree with Rose. This class has been very interesting so far.
Good. I'm glad. Well, that's all I had for today. So if we're okay, we can go ahead and wrap up a little bit early for today, and then I'll make sure that we have I'll make sure we're prepared for next Tuesday, if that's all right with everybody.
Yes, that's fine.
All right. Well, you guys, you too. You guys have a wonderful weekend, and take care of yourselves. Okay.
You too. Thank you.